In 1971, a family of 5 could spend a full day at Blackpool, eat until they couldn't move, and spend less than £2 doing it. Every single food they ate that day has now vanished from the British seaside forever. 12 foods. 12 things that were as much a part of a British seaside holiday as the sand between your toes and the wind that never quite stopped. Completely ordinary, never questioned, expected every single summer. Gone so completely now that most people under 40 have never heard of them. Number 10 on this list was sold on every pier in Britain from Brighton to Scarborough every single summer for over 100 years and disappeared within a single decade. Number 6 was so deeply connected to the British seaside that fishermen's wives along the Yorkshire coast made it fresh every morning before the boats came back in port, and the recipe died with them. And number 1, the food at the very end of this list. A food writer researching British coastal traditions in 2020 described it as the most complete sensory experience ever produced by British street food. We stopped selling it because it was too much trouble, too messy, too slow, too everything that the modern world decided it didn't have time for anymore. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what a proper British seaside day felt like and how much of it has been quietly taken from us. Number 12, potted shrimps in a paper cup. Not the kind you get now in a little ceramic pot in a delicatessen with a handwritten label and a price tag that makes you put it back on the shelf. The potted shrimps that sat in white paper cups in every seafront kiosk from Morecambe to Southend throughout the 1960s and 1970s were made fresh that morning from tiny brown shrimps caught the day before, cooked and packed into the cup with clarified butter seasoned with mace and cayenne pepper and left to set overnight. You bought them still cold, the butter pale and firm around the shrimps, and you ate them standing at the seawall with a wooden fork and brown bread if the kiosk had any left, or just the shrimps if it hadn't. They cost around 8p a cup in 1968 in Morecambe, which was the home of potted shrimps, had been the home of potted shrimps since before anyone could properly remember, and the Baxter family had been making them on the bay since 1799, not 1970, 1799. The supermarket killed the seaside kiosk slowly through the 1980s. Tourists stopped expecting fresh food at the coast because they'd stopped expecting fresh food anywhere. The paper cup disappeared and nothing replaced it. And if you think potted shrimps were the most undervalued thing on a British seafront, number 11 will make you reconsider that entirely. Number 11, whelks in brine, the whelk stall. If you grew up going to the British seaside in the 1960s or 1970s, you'll know exactly the image. A wooden barrow or a small open-fronted stall, usually run by a man of indeterminate age in a flat cap and an apron that had seen better days, with large enamel bowls of whelks in brine sitting on the counter and a jar of wooden pins for getting the meat out. Whelks, large sea snails, dark and slightly rubbery, tasting deeply and unmistakably of the sea, were boiled in salted water and sold by the pint in paper bags or cups with malt vinegar shaken over the top and a pin to extract each one from its shell. They cost around 6p a pint in 1965, and they were work to eat, proper work, using the pin to get the whelk out in one piece without it tearing. And that work was part of the point. You couldn't eat whelks in a hurry. You stood at the stall or sat on the wall and you worked through them slowly, and the sea was in front of you and the whole thing took as long as it took. You couldn't eat whelks in a hurry. The generation that ate them naturally grew old, and the generation behind them decided whelks were too much effort and too unfamiliar. And that work was part of the point. You couldn't eat whelks in a hurry. We're still 10 entries away from the food that a food writer called the most complete sensory experience in British street food history. But number 10 is coming, and number 10 is one that will stop you mid-thought the moment I describe it. But number 10 is coming, and number 10 is one that will stop you mid-thought the moment I describe it. Number 10, pier cockles with vinegar, every single pier from Brighton to Cleethorpes to Llandudno. A stall right there as you came onto the boards, usually within the first 50 yards, selling fresh cockles in a white paper cup with malt vinegar and white pepper. That was it. A stall right there as you came onto the boards, usually within the first 50 yards, selling fresh cockles in a white paper cup with malt vinegar and white pepper. That was it. Usually within the first 50 yards, selling fresh cockles in a white paper cup with malt vinegar and white pepper. That was it. Selling fresh cockles in a white paper cup with malt vinegar and white pepper. That was it. Cockles, small, sweet, slightly chewy bivalves that had been cooked in seawater that morning and kept warm in a covered container on the stall. Piled into a paper cup, doused in malt vinegar from a large bottle with a rubber stopper, shaken with white pepper, and handed over the counter for around 4p in 1966. The smell hit you before you'd decided you wanted them. That combination of vinegar and the particular clean smell of fresh shellfish, and the salt air from the sea below the pierboards. It was completely specific to that moment and that place, and nothing else in British food has ever replicated it. And we haven't yet reached the foods connected to specific fishing communities. Number 9 is one of those, and its story is more quietly devastating than anything else on this list so far. And we haven't yet reached the foods connected to specific fishing communities. Number 9 is one of those, and its story is more quietly devastating than anything else on this list so far. Number 9. Fresh dressed crab on the quayside, not crab in a sandwich from a supermarket chiller cabinet, not artificial crab meat formed into a stick and covered in crumbs. Fresh dressed crab, a whole crab caught that morning, boiled, cooled and dressed by hand on the quayside by the fisherman's wife, who'd been doing it every morning since before you were born. In fishing villages along the Cornish coast, in Cromer in Norfolk, where the crabs were considered the finest in Britain, and where crab dressing was a skill passed from mother to daughter across generations, in the small harbours of Devon and Dorset. Throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, you could walk to the quayside on a summer morning and buy a fresh-dressed crab for around 2 shillings directly from the family that had caught and prepared it. The brown meat packed into the shell, the white meat picked clean from the claws and legs, a little lettuce if they had it, brown bread wrapped in paper alongside. The women who could dress a crab in under 10 minutes, who knew every fold of the shell and every cavity where white meat hid, stopped teaching their daughters because there was no living in it anymore. That knowledge is largely gone, and we still haven't reached number 6, the one where the recipe died with the women who made it. But first, number 8. And number 8 is one that every person who ever had a proper British seaside holiday in the 1960s will remember the moment I say it. The cockle stalls went with them, and when the stalls went, the knowledge of where the cockles had come from and who had cooked them that morning went too. And when the stalls went, the knowledge of where the cockles had come from and who had cooked them that morning went too. A large copper or steel urn, always slightly battered, sitting on a trestle or built into a small wooden stall on the seafront. Inside, mushy peas kept at a rolling simmer all day long, proper dried marrow-fat peas soaked overnight and cooked low and slow until they collapsed into a thick, khaki-green, intensely savoury mass. Ladled into a cup and handed over with a small wooden spoon and a shake of salt and malt vinegar. Hot peas cost around 3p a cup in 1967, and on a cold British summer day, which was most British summer days, they were the thing that sorted everything out. You'd been on the beach since 10. The wind had been cutting across from the sea all afternoon. Your chips from an hour ago were a distant memory. And then the pea stall appeared, and the smell of those hot peas in the salt air hit you, and everything was suddenly manageable again. Pea stalls were a northern seaside tradition, particularly Scarborough, Whitby, Bridlington, Filey, all had them regularly through the 1960s and 1970s. Fast food homogenised the British seaside food offer through the 1980s. Burger vans needed less skill, kept longer, and appealed to a younger generation that hadn't grown up with pea stalls. The urn went cold. We are halfway through this list now, and the foods still ahead are the ones most deeply connected to specific places and specific people. Here is something worth sitting with before we go further. The British seaside holiday meant something specific to working-class families throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It was the one week of the year, sometimes the only week, when money was spent on pleasure without apology. Fathers saved for it from January. Mothers packed for it a week in advance. Children talked about it from Easter onwards, and the food was central to what it meant. Not because it was special food in the way that a restaurant meal is special, but because it was food eaten outside, in salt air, with the sea in front of you, with your whole family around you, when nobody was rushing and nobody was working, and the only decision that mattered was whether you had chips or peas or both. They were wrong about what people wanted. They were right about what people would accept. And the acceptance cost us everything still to come on this list. Number 6, most of all. And the acceptance cost us everything still to come on this list. Number 6, most of all. Number 7. Sandwiches wrapped in greaseproof paper from the beach cafe. Not the cafe itself. The particular sandwich from the particular kind of beach cafe that existed only in Britain, only in the 1960s, and has now been entirely replaced by things that don't deserve to share the name. A wooden or pebble-dash building set back from the seafront, run by a woman, always a woman, who'd been there since before the war, and who knew every family that came back summer after summer. Inside, a glass counter with sandwiches already made that morning and wrapped individually in greaseproof paper, egg and cress, potted meat, fish paste, cheese and pickle, sitting in rows beside a large urn of strong tea already brewed. Sitting in rows beside a large urn of strong tea already brewed. You pointed at what you wanted. She lifted it with tongs and put it on the counter. A round of sandwiches cost around 6 pence in 1964. The tea came in a thick white cup with a saucer and cost 4 pence. You took it outside to a wooden bench overlooking the sea and you ate it, and that was the best meal of the holiday. Not because the sandwiches were remarkable, because everything around them was. The beach cafe as an institution was killed by planning law changes and increased ground rents through the 1970s and 1980s. The woman who ran it retired and nobody took over because the economics no longer worked. A Wimpy or a burger van replaced it, and it was not even slightly the same thing. And number 6, the one where the recipe genuinely died, is next. Number 6, fishwife's smoked herring paste on bread. Along the Yorkshire coast, Whitby, Filey, Flamborough Head, and in fishing communities in Scotland, and the northeast of England, fishwives made a herring paste every morning from the previous day's catch. Smoked herring, bloaters or kippers depending on where you were, broken from the bone by hand, mixed with a small amount of butter and a scraping of mustard and worked into a paste. In a bowl with the back of a fork until smooth and spreadable, then packed into a pot or spread directly onto thick slices of bread cut from a proper loaf. It was sold from doorsteps, from harbour walls, from small tables set up on the quayside in the early morning before the tourist trade properly started. It cost almost nothing, a few pennies in the early 1960s, and it tasted specifically and entirely of the place it had been made, the sea it had come from, the smoke of the curing house up the lane, the particular quality of the morning air on the Yorkshire coast in July. The women who made it learned from their mothers and their mothers before them. It was never written down. There was no need to write it down because it was simply known. The ratio of fish to butter, the amount of mustard, the way to work it smooth without overworking it. When the fishing industry along the Yorkshire coast contracted through the 1970s, the fishwives who made the paste stopped making it. Their daughters had moved to Leeds or Bradford for work and hadn't taken the knowledge with them. The recipe exists nowhere. It is gone as completely as the women who carried it. 3 items left on this list, and we haven't yet reached the one that only appeared for 6 weeks every year, and whose disappearance left a gap in the British summer that nothing has ever filled. But number 5 comes first. Number 5, freshly boiled lobster from the harbour wall. In fishing ports along the Cornish coast, Padstow, St Ives, Mevagisay, and in Cromer and Wells next the sea in Norfolk, throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, you could buy a freshly boiled lobster directly from the fisherman for around 5 shillings. Half a lobster. A whole one if it had been a good season and the price was right. Eaten right there on the harbour wall with your fingers and a small wooden pick for the claw meat. And nothing else alongside except perhaps a piece of brown bread, if someone had thought to bring it. No mayonnaise from a squeezy bottle, no garnish, no plate. Just a lobster that had been in the sea 12 hours ago and was now in your hands, with the sun on the water behind you and the smell of rope and diesel from the boats moored alongside. This was not a luxury experience in the way that lobster has since become, a thing you order in a restaurant for £40, with a glass of something cold and a waiter who describes it to you. It was simply what you did when you were in Cornwall in the summer and the boats had come in. It was simply what you did when you were in Cornwall in the summer and the boats had come in. Export markets changed the economics through the 1970s. Live lobsters fetched better prices shipped to France and Spain than sold to holidaymakers on the harbour wall. The fishermen followed the money because the money was survival. The harbour wall lobster went with them. And we're now at number 4, and number 4 only appeared for 6 weeks a year, and its loss is felt every single summer even now by people who barely remember it existed. Number 4. Samphire from the salt marsh, sold at the roadside. For 6 weeks every summer, late June through to early August, in Norfolk and along the Essex coast, and in parts of Wales and the West Country, women and sometimes children went out onto the salt marshes at low tide with baskets and cut marsh samphire, that bright green succulent plant that grows in tidal mudflats and tastes unlike anything else that exists in British food, and brought it back and sat at the roadside or in small market stalls in coastal villages, and sold it by the bag to anyone driving past or walking through. Samphire in 1966 cost around 6p a pound at a roadside stall in Blakeney in Norfolk. You boiled it briefly in unsalted water, it was salty enough already from the marsh, and ate it with melted butter, pulling the fleshy part from the central stalk with your teeth in a way that required no particular elegance, and produced a flavour that was so entirely and specifically of the sea and the marsh, and the particular quality of a Norfolk summer evening that describing it to someone who has never eaten it is essentially impossible. The women who cut it knew which parts of the marsh to go to and which to leave. They knew the tide times and the weather and the particular way samphire grew in their particular stretch of coast. When the generation that did this grew old and the younger generation moved away, the roadside samphire stall went with them. You can now buy samphire in Waitrose in a plastic bag for £3.50. It tastes of a cold distribution warehouse. It tastes of nothing. It is not the same. And number 3 is coming, and number 3 is the food that connected the British seaside to something much older and much more important than a summer holiday. Number 3, jellied eels from the seafront stall. From Southend to Margate, from Hastings to Whitstable, the jellied eel stall was a fixture on the Thames estuary and Kent coast seafront from before living memory right through to the late 1980s. Fresh eels, caught in the Thames estuary, or brought down from the rivers of East Anglia, chopped into short lengths, simmered in a court bouillon of water, herbs and a little vinegar until tender, chopped into short lengths, simmered in a court bouillon until tender, then packed into deep china bowls and covered with the cooking liquid, which set overnight into a clear, savoury, slightly gelatinous jelly that held everything in place, served cold, straight from the bowl, with liquor, a bright green parsley sauce alongside, and a generous shake of malt vinegar over the top. A portion cost around 8p in 1969 in Southend. The Tubby Isaacs stall in Aldgate had been selling them since 1919 and didn't close until 2013, the last of its kind, still there long after everything around it had changed beyond recognition. The Thames eel population collapsed through overfishing and river pollution across the 1970s and 1980s. The supply dried up, and the stalls that had depended on it closed one by one. And the particular combination of cold eel and clear jelly and sharp vinegar and green liquor that had been a part of the East London and Thames estuary experience for well over 100 years is now gone from almost every seafront in Britain. 2 entries left. Number 2 first, and then the one the food writer called the most complete sensory experience in British street food history. Number 2, shrimp teas served in boarding house dining rooms. This one requires a moment of explanation because the institution that produced it no longer exists, and without understanding the institution, the food makes no sense. The British Seaside boarding house, a terraced house, usually Victorian or Edwardian, 3 stories, bay windows looking out toward the sea or toward the street that led to the sea, run by a landlady who made the rules and expected them to be followed, and who fed you breakfast and high tea as part of the weekly rate, which ran to around £4.10 for a family of 4 in 1965 in Scarborough or Bridlington or Weston-super-Mare. High tea was served at 5:30 sharp, not 5:20, not 5:40, 5:30. And in the boarding houses of the Yorkshire coast and the Lancashire resorts and the Norfolk seaside villages, high tea in summer meant one specific thing: a plate of fresh brown shrimps caught locally that morning, boiled and cooled, served still in their shells in a large bowl in the centre of the table, alongside brown bread and butter already cut into triangles, a pot of strong tea and a dish of something sweet to finish. The shrimps were the point. You peeled them at the table, it took as long as it took, and the landlady didn't rush you. And the shells went into a bowl, provided for the purpose, and the peeled shrimps went onto your bread and butter, and you ate them and drank your tea. And the light was coming in golden through the net curtains, and outside you could hear the gulls. Package holidays to Spain killed the British boarding house. By 1975, the numbers were falling sharply. By 1985, most had converted to bed and breakfast only, no evening meal. And the high tea tradition went with the evening meal, and the shrimps went with the high tea, and a very specific and very lovely part of British life simply ceased. And now we're here. Number one. Fresh winkles with vinegar and a pin, eaten on the sea wall. Your granddad knew how to do this properly. That's the first thing to understand. It wasn't something you needed to be taught exactly, but it was something you watched and copied and got wrong the first few times until the technique settled into your fingers, and then you never forgot it. A paper bag of winkles, tiny black sea snails smaller than your thumbnail, boiled in salted water that morning, and sold by the pint from a barrow. Or a stall on the seafront for around 5p a bag in 1964, a small bottle of malt vinegar and a pin. A real pin, the kind that had probably been straightened from a bent one found in a coat pocket or the bottom of a bag. You held the winkle between your finger and thumb, you worked the pin into the opening of the shell, and you extracted the small dark coiled creature inside in a single clean movement if you were doing it right. Or in 3 frustrated attempts if you weren't, and then you ate it. Just ate it straight off the pin, and the taste was so entirely specific to that moment and that place. Cold, saline, slightly chewy, with the vinegar sharp over the top. And then you did it again, and again. And you sat on the sea wall, and the sun was probably not out, because the sun was often not out on a British seaside holiday, and the wind was probably doing what it always did. And the gulls were making their particular gulls noise, and your granddad was working through his winkles faster than anyone else because he'd been doing it since before the war, and he held the pin differently from everyone else in a way that only he could explain and never quite did. A food writer examining the history of British seaside food in 2020 wrote that fresh winkles eaten on the sea wall with a pin and vinegar represented the most complete sensory experience in British street food, not because of the flavour alone, but because of everything that surrounded it. The texture of the sea wall beneath you, the sound of the water, the smell of the salt air and the vinegar together, the specific small skill of the pin, the unhurried pace that the eating itself demanded. You could not rush winkles. The winkle stalls on British seafronts disappeared through the 1980s and 1990s, as the generation that had grown up eating them declined in number, and the generation behind them chose something faster and more familiar. The last winkle barrows closed without ceremony or notice. Nobody organised a campaign to save them. Nobody thought to. They were just gone one summer, and the following summer nobody noticed they weren't there. That is the saddest thing about every food on this list. Not that they were taken. Not that anyone decided they should go. Just that they left so quietly that most of us didn't even turn around to watch them go. Your granddad knew how to use the pin. Did you ever ask him to show you? Most of us didn't. We thought there would be more time. There wasn't more time. There never is. Tell me in the comments which one you remember, or which one your family looked forward to every single summer without fail.